Can you hear me at the back? I guess you can. Uh, Thank you all for coming for the next and the last session of the day. Hopefully, those who are traveling from New York are not super jet lagged. My name is Sumit Chopra. I'm a faculty in the Department of Computer Science at New York University and also have a joint appointment at the School of Medicine, NYU Grossman School of Medicine. And it's a pleasure to be here to chair this session in this wonderful, wonderful event that has been organized in collaboration with IITP and others. And today's session, as the name suggests, is about essentially advanced AI applications in robotics and healthcare. And we have a line of excellent speakers, 2 in robotics and 2 of them in healthcare. And followed by that, we'll have a panel discussion, much like the last session. And it's a pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Lerrel Pinto, who's a faculty at Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences. And he's one of the world leaders in robotics, and would love to hear from what he has to say.
Awesome.
And maybe you can welcome him with a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, especially the ones who are, like me, suffering from a bit of jet lag. So in today's talk, I want to give you some of my perspectives of robot learning, the interaction of robots, data, and how the field is moving forward. I also want to give a bit of a perspective of where I think this field is going to be in the next 10 years. Okay? So maybe just to kick things off, right? I always like to show this video to sort of like inspire us on how some things are so easy for us to do. So most of us are able to open like a can quite easily, but for a robot, this is quite hard. And if you think about it, it's hard because you have to first acquire the object, put your index finger right under the tab, apply just the right amount of pressure to open it without spilling all the drink all over you, right? So it's really, really complex, but humans can do this really easily. Now, it's not just this level of dexterity which is amazing in humans. What is even more amazing is that you can do this for a wide variety of tasks. It's not just that we're using hands for one specific thing. Okay, so the goal of my research lab and at least our general team has been in order to make robots as general as possible. So what this boils down to is, if I give you a robot, we want this robot to basically work anywhere for any task that you care about. Okay? And so a lot of our work is geared towards this. And so I'll talk to you a bit about how we are sort of trying to push this mission. Okay, so before I talk about what we are doing right now, let me rewind a bit. Let me take you all the way back to 2015, when actually I got started in robotics, and sort of paint you a picture of where we were then, how far we have come, and where we have to go next. Okay, so in 2015, one of the first problems I looked at was the problem of trying to pick up objects. Okay, and the way to sort of think about it is, imagine there's a robot, there's a bunch of objects in front of the robot, and the robot has to figure out how to grasp these objects and be able to pick them up. So at this time, the sort of predominant approach was what you would call analytic approaches. So what you would do over here is, given an object, you would first fit a 3D model over this object. Then you would sort of, using a physics-based model, figure out what the right way to grasp it, and then sort of finally be able to pick it up. But the issue over here is, you need all this information. You need to have 3D models, you need to be able to fit it, you have to know prior information like the weight of the object, the friction of the object, all of this sort of stuff, right? So if you're coming from like a vision or language community, this almost like feels reminiscent of how things were back in the day. You had all these modules that were like tied to each other. And the problem was that when you have all these modules tied to each other, errors in one module just compounds, right? And so then we saw, okay, instead of having all of this, you just replace all of that with a big, deep neural network, and all your problems are solved, almost, right? Okay, so similarly in robotics in 2015, we were seeing that we're hitting up against similar issues with these modules and errors compounding over here. And it was sort of ripe for learning, right? It was clearly a problem that was important, and clearly one where a lot of the enabling features were there. So I think the three main enabling features over here was first, we saw that deep learning actually works, especially in NLP and vision, right? So we had a proof point that, okay, it works, so maybe it can work in robotics. Next, GPUs were getting accessible. So doing this type of computation, GFLOPs were getting cheaper and cheaper. And then finally, from an academic perspective, robots were getting cheaper. If you think about doing learning, if you think about data, robots are needed to get this data. And hence, that becoming cheaper really allows many, many labs to buy robots, many labs to collect data, and to actually do learning on top of this. Okay. But one key element is missing in 2015, right? You know that deep learning works, GPUs are cheap, robots are cheap, but there is no data, right? If you think about, again, just going back to vision and language, you have data on the internet. There is no internet for robots where you just upload all the data and share it freely. So the first thing we looked at is how can you make robots sort of self-collect data and learn from that data. So here is a robot just randomly trying to pick objects up on the table. It senses success or failure using a sensor in its hand. And then from the success and failure, it tries to fit a model on it and then try to do the graphs which are more successful. And so starting with this random interaction, what you can really do is train the system and go to a point where it can now pick up objects with a very high rate of success. So here is a trained model which starts from that random picks and then ends up in this mode of picking up objects, which works, works on most objects. Okay, so this approach of self-collecting data, training on this data, scaling this data up, has sort of seen a lot of different tasks. You can use it for this picking up objects. You can also use it on drones. Other groups have looked at it for other types of motions like pushing things on the table. And then folks at Google sort of scaled it up, took an order of magnitude more robots, and saw that you can get more gains with this. Okay, so this is all like 2016, 2017, and you may ask, what happened to this? Why are people not doing this anymore? The reason is that data is still limited, and it is still limited because you need robots to collect this data, right? And so just to sort of think about this, right? If you think about the total number of robots sold, it's like around 5 million in terms of robot arms, right? And just to sort of give you scale, the number of phones that are sold is close to like 3 billion, which is like a much, much bigger number, right? So if you think about the hardware needed to generate data, you have this big discrepancy in the number of sort of devices there to create this data. So one of the first thoughts we had is, okay, how can we get a robot pretty much in every person's hand? How can we scale up robot data beyond the amount of robot hardware available out there? Okay, so that's the question we are going to answer. How do we get a robot in everyone's hand? So to sort of answer this question, we kickstarted this long line of work where we're trying to learn from handheld tools. Okay? So to give you an example of a handheld tool, you can see this one on the left. It's basically a reacher grabber with 2 fingers that open and close. You can mount an iPhone on it. The iPhone gives you both observational data and action data. There's IMUs in it, so as you move this tool around, you can sense how this tool is moving in space. Okay? So once you have this tool, data from this tool can directly transfer to a robot. So over here, I'm showing you an example of the tool which is retrofitted on the end effector of a robot. So again, you just need to put an iPhone on the end effector of the robot, and basically every data point you get from this tool is almost like you got the data from the robot, right? So this is one way in which you can scale this data now. And it's just that this way in which you get data is also transferable. So if you want to make it work on a different robot, so that robot on the right is a more industrial-grade robot, you can just put a different end effector on it with that same iPhone, right? So it's sort of very scalable once you get data in this platform. So after we had this tool, what we did is we are in New York, so we can just go to many homes in New York and collect a bunch of data. And we showed that you can actually scale this for a wide variety of tasks in multiple homes all around the place, right? Now, of course, this is not an end state. We are continually improving our tools. You can see in 2020, we started with this very weird reacher grabber tool with a GoPro on it. Then we sort of eventually replaced the GoPro camera with the iPhone, which is a lot more scalable. We have also worked quite a bit on the shape and size of the tools as well to make it ergonomically easier to collect data. And now there are a lot more extensions that we are working on that we are hopefully going to release by the end of the year. So stay tuned for that. Okay, one sort of really interesting proof point over here was that we were able to see zero-shot generalization using data, which was collected from these tools. And by zero-shot, what I mean is once you train a model for a task, let's say opening a door, you can now fairly reliably open any door you see. So on the left-hand side, we are using this robot to open a microwave door in some random Airbnb, some drawers over here as well. And you can take the same model. We took it to Karl in Germany, and it works on some random cabinet that we bought from IKEA over there. Right? So these models are now quite general enough that you can apply it on new objects, new scenarios that you have not seen before. Okay, so are we there yet? Have we solved this generalization problem in robotics? And the answer is still no, right? And the reason is, okay, so we solved the problem of needing to have robots to collect the data, but we still need humans to collect the data. You still need to give this tool to people and ask them to go out there and ask them to collect data. And now that is the limitation, right? Because now you have to sort of pay someone to give you data. For a lot of the vision language training, a lot of this data just existed, right? People themselves are uploading data and it's just available for you to use. And so we have been starting to think about how to make this data collection and this ability for robots to learn from sources beyond having to ask someone to collect data for that task. Okay? So here is where we have been looking quite a bit at these smart glass-like technology. One interesting statistic, if you did not know, is that Meta's Ray-Bans have sold already 2 million early this year, and probably closer to the 10 million-ish mark now, right? So this is quite a consumer device now. There's loads of people having these glasses. So the question is, can we actually learn something useful for robots using these glasses? The answer is yes. Here is a recent project that we call Ego Zero. The way this works is you basically just wear these smart glasses. This specific smart glass is called the Aria glass. So all the visuals you're seeing over here, all the pixels, are recorded from these cameras inside the glasses you wear. Okay? And so with this, you can just do daily life activities, moving things around, cleaning up your home, making coffee, doing all this sort of stuff. And then once you have this data, you can now learn robot models, robot policies on this data, and transfer it onto a robot. So here is just an illustration of how that works. We showed a task of picking up a piece of bread, putting it in a pan, and now with very small amounts of data, with very quick training, we can now transfer this behavior onto the robot. Okay? And of course, it's also sort of general across the exact type of object and the viewpoints as well. So to illustrate this, we sort of move the camera around and show that it can still succeed. Okay. So there are sort of two axes in which we are able to get zero-shot results. So the first axis is that in training time, you see images of human hands, right? And now somehow you have to transfer from images and videos of human hands onto images and videos of robot hands. Right, so that's the first axis that we're able to transfer. And the second axis is that the objects and the scenes that you operate in as a human may not be the same as the robot, right? So maybe maybe when you are collecting data, it's in a microwave at your home, which may be of some make and model, but the robot may see a different microwave it's never seen before. So we're able to show that using new algorithms, we can actually transfer this from both human to robot, and from one scene and one type of objects to another. Okay, the other direction we have been looking at is scaling beyond just visual data. So everything I've shown you so far all the models, all the learning is happening on top of visual models. Okay? So to emphasize that vision is not enough, let me just take the same approach I showed you one slide ago, and try it out on this task. So the task here is to pick up an egg and place it in the bowl, and we're going to train this only with visual data and run this model. Okay, clearly not able to work, and it's sort of understandable, right? Like if it has no sense of how much force to apply on this object, and just from vision alone, you cannot really say how much force to apply on this object. So the key over here is to get the sense of force. So for this, we have been creating sensors at our lab. One example of a sensor is this thing, which is called AnySkin. The way it works is it's like magnetic particles embedded inside an elastomer. And so once you apply pressure on it, it changes the magnetic field around it. And so you can use sensors to then get a sense of how much force has been applied on them. Okay, so with this, you can now give your robots a sense of touch, where once it's, when it tries to pick up an object, it now knows how much force it's applying on it. Okay, a common question I get over here is this egg still a raw egg or a boiled egg? So you'll have to trust me that this was actually a raw egg and it still ended up working. Okay, so from here on, I want to talk a little bit about what are the topics that we are interested in and trying to push, and I think is going to be really important as we move forward for robot AI in the next few years. So I think the first thing is being able to make robots work with multi-fingered hands. So we have been trying to push this quite a bit. Irmak, who's over here and going to give the next presentation, is going to talk a lot more about this, so I won't talk as much. The second thing is touch and vision. You know, I think as humans, we have access to such a large variety of inputs. Robots do not. And so trying to come up with ways in which we can combine all of this information and get robots to effectively use this is going to be really important. Again, I think Irmak is going to talk a bit about it, so I won't. And then finally, one of the things you may have realized is that I actually didn't talk anything about algorithms over here. I didn't sort of show any learning algorithm over here. And that's because I think a lot of the algorithms we are using are still quite preliminary. We're doing a lot of like behavior cloning, imitation learning style stuff still. But to go into the future, we have to move on to a more reasoning-like framework. So to sort of like emphasize reasoning, here is for an example of reasoning. So this is Patrick, the orangutan that is able to figure out how to make knots. Clearly, this robot has not seen millions of hours of YouTube data and still figured out how to do this. And so the critical question is, how can we get robots to do this? How can we get robots to reason about objects that it's not seen before, and with very limited amount of experience, do interesting and cool things like this? Okay, so I see that we are ending up against time, and I want to have a little bit of time for questions. So I'll quickly jump ahead. I want to thank my lab and for this wonderful program that supports the research. Here are just a few folks in my lab in Central Park in New York. Yeah, so if you're ever around there, hit us up. We'd love to show you both around New York and our lab. And so with that, I'll end over here, and I'll take any questions that you may have. Thanks.
Thanks, Lerrel, for a great talk. Questions, anybody? Yes.
Thank you for a nice talk. My question was like, how many fingers do you think is needed for like multi-finger end effector kind of thing? Like, do you think just 3 enough, or like more and more is better? Like,
yeah. So the question is, how many fingers are needed for hands? I think I have 2 answers for you. So I think for solving a task, right? I think even with 2 fingers, you can solve a lot of tasks. I think each finger you add gives you like a diminishing returns. Now the reason I like 5 fingers is because our hands have 5 fingers. A lot of the objects that we have designed for us are designed to be held with 5 fingers, right? So I think that's one reason where I feel like going to 5 fingers is going to be important. The other aspect is sort of from a learning perspective. If I'm trying to learn from human videos, human hands have 5 fingers in those videos. So if I'm trying to transfer as much of that onto robots, maybe having 5 fingers is going to be more useful. Yeah. So I think it's both, like on the functional side, I think maybe 2 to 3 fingers is useful. But on the learning side, I do think having 5 fingers may give you a bit more of a boost there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Is there a question?
One question over here, please.
So thank you for your insightful talk, and I have some question about like, so you show like we can actually collect some data using like AR glasses or like handheld tools, but how can we actually like scale up those kind of approaches to use some like in the wild human videos that we already have in the internet? So like what are some kind of like bottlenecks that we have when we are trying to use those kind of data?
Yeah, so I think to scale it up, right? What you have to do is first have access to these glasses. So I think we are working on this where we can get access to large amount of these glasses that we can then distribute to people to scale up how much data we are able to collect. Now, of course, we have to figure out how to do this in a responsible way as well, where you want to make sure you're in environments where you're allowed to collect this data as well. So we're working on these aspects as well. I do think for general work, right, the amount of effort you would need to wear a glass and do it is actually not that much, right? So I think once the price point of these glasses come down, it's also going to make the cost of collecting robot data really, really cheap. So that's how I think the future is. There's still a bit of blockers, like the cost of these glasses. How do you collect this data in a responsible way? But I think we'll like figure that out in the next like year or so. Yeah, is my estimation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. I guess we are out of time, so let's thank the speaker once again. And our next speaker again is one who's a robotics researcher. Her name is Irmak Guzey, and she'll be talking about teaching hands to think, design data, and autonomy in dexterous manipulation. Please welcome with a big round of applause.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Irmak. I'm a Ph.D. student at NYU, advised by Lerrel, Pinto. And I'm very humbled to be here. And today I would like to talk to you about my research. My research focuses on imitation learning for dexterous manipulation for multi-fingered hands and learning from human videos. And today I would like to talk to you about bridging the embodiment gap between human and robot hands. So as a starters, a very simplistic recipe for imitation learning right now that is being iterated in the literature a lot is we have a robot set up that we can control to complete set of tasks. This control is usually made through like a different teleoperation frameworks. So we teleoperate the robot to complete tasks, and then we collect paired robot observation and action data. And then with this data, we can train policies. Given a robot observation, these policies are trying to predict robot actions. There has been a lot of work that try to improve architectures that can improve these robot policies, and it is pretty well iterated at this point. But the issue with this simple recipe is that teleoperation takes a huge human effort. And as also like what Lerrel mentioned is we are pretty much limited with the amount of robot that we have and like trained teleoperators that we have. And especially when we try to have similar approaches for robotic hands, this retargeting, this teleoperation issue even becomes harder and harder. So in the community nowadays, we have a lot of effort to to utilize human data such that we can have proper annotations so that we can train policies from human data. And again, a very simplistic recipe for this branch of imitation learning is we collect human data. This can be done by either ARIA glasses, Quest datasets, or having access to already existing scaled human data on internet. Then retarget this human data to the robot. By retargeting, what I mean is being able to deploy a given human trajectory on the robot hand. And a very naive way to retarget would be a simple inverse kinematics. But as I will talk about a little bit later, inverse kinematics is not enough to complete a task, because when we really think about it, we don't necessarily want to match the trajectory of human hand to a robot hand, but we would like to match the completion of tasks when we retarget, which I will talk about more. But yeah, the second step will be to retarget to robot, and then with this retargeted data, we can train policies. Some work also do the other way around. They train policies on human data and then retarget to the robot afterwards, but some sort of retargeting step is required. And the issues we have in this branch is hands are morphologically very different. Human hands are very soft, very compact, very dexterous, whereas robot hands are large and bulky and does not have a lot of degrees of freedom. And hands are visually also very different. So the policies trained with human data does not necessarily generalize well when deployed on a robot. So in this talk, I would like to talk about two of my efforts on solving these tasks, solving these problems. The first question that I want to talk about is how can we close the human-to-robot embodiment gap for learning from human data? And the second part is how can we design better robot hands such that we have less of this embodiment gap to begin with. So, and we have some videos here. Yeah, so to begin with. As we all know, and I think, we all love human video. It is very easy to collect. It is pretty accessible, and we're very capable, so we can complete a lot of tasks very easily. But if you look at a human video that is completing a task like this, opening a music box, and if you look at a video of robot completing a similar task, the trajectories of these two morphologies are very different. The way the wrist moves, the way the fingers move, they're completely different. And also visually, when you look at them, the robot hand is very different than the human hand. So in this work that I am going to talk about, we iterated on how can we, given a trajectory that looks like on the right, a human video, how can we transfer that to the robot such that robots also complete the same similar tasks. So this is Hudor, and we aimed to close the embodiment gap between human and robot using online reinforcement learning with object-centric rewards. So what do I mean by that? Let's say that we have a human video and we have a robot trajectory of this trajectory inverse kinematically replayed on the robot by simple inverse kinematic. So we have a human and a robot following the same trajectory. So we first segment out the object that is manipulated using language grounded segment anything algorithm, and then we track this object throughout these two sets of trajectories. So with these two different trajectories, what we aim to do is we're trying to learn a residual policy that will be added on top of this open loop trajectory replay that is naively replayed by inverse kinematics. And given these tracks, object tracks, now we can compare how the object moved across different trajectories and use that to guide this residual learning process. So to give more details, we calculate the centroid of these objects, the points that are tracked, and then we compare them, basically time-wise, mean squared error, compare them between different human and robot trajectories, and then use that as a reward to guide our reinforcement learning algorithm. And then this residual policy that is learned, it is simple fingertip offsets that are added to this inverse kinematic, this trajectory replayed on the robot. And in this way, we are able to learn policies under 1 hour of online interaction, and the robot is able to open the music box, similar to human as well. We also took a look at the generalization capabilities of policies trained with Hudor. So this is for one of our other tasks, cart sliding. And policies that are trained on the original object, we directly deploy them on new objects with different language prompts. And we observe that while the visual differences of the object and the new object and the original object does not impact the performance as much, but the weight and the shape of the object is impacts it significantly. And this is due to lack of touch feedback, because since the robot does not have any way to enforce force information, it fails to pick up slides cards that are too light. And we observe similar problem here as well. Like when we're trying to pick up an object, when the shape is different than the original object, at least as much as the hand is able to grasp the object, it is able to complete. But if the weight or the slipperiness of the object is different, then the models seem to struggle. And in order to enable spatial generalization, the focus of this work was to majorly close this embodiment gap between human and robot. So during training, we did not have any spatial generalization enforced. So in order to have spatial generalization, what we did is during deployment time, whenever we have a new object location, we calculate the offset of this object location between the original and the new object, and then we add that offset to the arm. This simple way to enable spatial generalization gave relatively successful policies for bread picking, whereas the precision is not that important. It succeeded pretty well in a evaluation area of 30 to 50 centimeters, whereas for music box opening, where the precision is very important, the success rate is slightly less. But we see that this still succeeds relatively okay in a smaller area. So this was Hudor. This is also the example deployment of the cart sliding task that I showed before. The major limitations of this work was, the first one is applying real enforcement learning in real world is difficult, and also limits the amount of capability that we can learn, in my opinion. So I think thinking about alternatives of this work where we can move everything to simulation and then trying to learn things in simulation is an interesting approach. But there as well, this is all trade-offs, because there as well we're also limited in the way we simulate, the way we model objects. And the other limitation I would say is tracking objects in 2D. And there are actually following works from this work that tracks objects in 3D. You can also check them out if you like. So the second question that I want to ask is, as I mentioned it before, how can we design cheap, capable, and humanoid robot hands? So previously, in the previous work, the hand that we used was a Lerrel hand. It's a direct-driven hand, which means it has motors in the joints, which makes the hand pretty bulky. It's also a company hand, so when something is broken, we always need to send it back and wait for 3 months for it to be repaired, and that would also cause a lot of problems. So what we wanted to push for in our lab recently is how can we design a robotic hand that is open sourced, such that everyone can use. If something is broken, everyone can fix it. That is cheap, $1,300 to build, where the major cost is because of the motors that we have. It takes only 7 hours to build. It has large degrees of freedom, and it's humanoid. So in order to have all of these items, all of these parts of a hand that we want, we chose to have build our hand tendon-driven. So we moved all of the motors to the wrist. This enabled the hand to be stronger, so that now the hand doesn't need to carry its own motors as weights as well. And it also makes the hand compact. We 3D printed it. Everything is 3D printable, so which makes the hand pretty light. But because all of the motors are now on the wrist, the control is now like non-trivial. It becomes like more complicated than it used to be compared to direct-driven hands. Because there is no one-to-one mapping between the motor and joints, and it's slightly more complicated to control. So in order to compensate for the dynamic information that we don't know how to model in the tendons, and also the fact that we don't have one-to-one mapping between the tendon and the joints, we utilized a learning-based data-driven approach to learn the controller. So what we did is we attached a human motion capture glove to the hand. These like green tips that you see is the magnetic sensors of the motion capture glove, and on the back of the hand there is a magnetic sensor as well. So this hand, this sensor basically captures where the fingertips are and where the joints are with the motion of the hand. So what we did is we randomly moved the motors of the wrist, and while doing that we also saved the corresponding joint angles and motor positions. And with this paired data, a motor position and joint angle paired data, we trained a controller. This is a sequential model. It's an LSTM. It inputs the past 10 desired fingertip positions, and it outputs the necessary motor position, and the whole system is trained end-to-end. It is a very small model. It's only 1 million parameter. It works at a CPU with 25 hertz control speed. And with this way, we were actually able to train teleoperate pretty interesting tasks. So this is Ruka sawing a sponge, which sort of showcases the strength of the hand, I would say. This is another task, opening up a Nutella jar. Again, all of these are teleoperated. This is some sort of in-hand orientation of a screwdriver. And finally, this is a battery insertion. And I would like to also point out that all of these objects that we teleoperated with, none of them are, like all of them are real-world objects. And none of them are 3D printed. They are objects that we use, which is valuable for generalizable robot learning, I believe. So yes, this was Ruka. Major limitations of this work is the most important part of it is lack of wrist. In human motion, in all of the videos that we see and we collect, wrist motion is very important. Humans use their wrists a lot, so I think thinking about how we can add wrists is important, and this is an ongoing project, and we're hoping to improve hardware as we go. And the second part of it is right now, like reliance on this motion capture glove, and even though we showcase generalization capabilities of one controller trained in one hand into another hand, in order to have a better, more accurate controller, there is still a reliance on this motion capture glove, which right now we're trying to solve that problem as well. We're trying to think about solutions on how we can improve this controller so that there will be no need to have motion capture gloves. So yes, this was what I prepared. It would not be possible without my amazing collaborators in my lab. And thank you very much for your attention. Yeah, and I would love to have questions if there are any.
Thanks, Irmak, for a great talk. We have time for questions. Anybody? Questions? Okay, cool. I guess since nobody has a question, I'll ask one. I guess one of my questions is that why is it necessary to replicate the hardware that is similar to a human, right? Like, human has 5 fingers. You showed a hand that has 5 fingers. Why not 7, 10? That might make life easier. Is that? Mm-hmm. So why do we go that route?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think My response, I think, like, is going to be pretty similar to Lerrel's as well. I think there are two, there are two parts that we should think about when we think about number of fingers. One of them is the dexterity that it adds, and the other is transfer capability that we have with the number of fingers. I think if we have 5 fingers, the transfer is going to be easier and easier. If you have exact replica of a human hand, then the transfer of these like retargeting issue will become less and less. But if you have, for example, larger number of fingers, then the dexterity of interactions might be easier to solve, maybe, because then like the interactions that we will have with the objects maybe will take shorter time. But even learning priors that will accomplish these dexterities then will become bigger problems. Then we would probably need to train these agents in reinforcement, like using RL in simulation that will solve these set of tasks. And in order to do that, we would need to probably engineer all of the rewards that we're going to build. And also, letting alone all of that, we would need to build all of these environments, like human environments, in simulation. So the low-level interactions would become so much more complicated, which I think is a good trade-off to have. Like I think like having limited dexterity, like limited to human dexterity, but being able to scale more is more valuable. So yeah, I think that's one.
So essentially, you're saying that like being closer to human, it's easier to sort of get the data and subsequently train it easier, as opposed to if it were a totally different piece of hardware that does not resemble. Gotcha. That makes sense.
Exactly.
Essentially, transfer makes sense. Cool.
Yeah, thank you.
Any questions? Cool. I guess let's just thank the speaker once again.
Thank you very much.
And our next speaker is Dr. Oermann, who's a faculty at NYU Grossman School of Medicine and also a neurosurgeon. And he will be talking about delivering clinical care using AI. So please welcome him with a round of applause.
Awesome. Really excited to be talking here about delivering clinical care with AI. First, I have some disclosures. I have these, not relevant to this talk. Probably my most important slide is my first one, and it's that I really believe that AI for healthcare is the single most important use of AI. And my major argument for this is that the vast majority of the world has an incredible amount of computing in their pockets in the form of smartphones, over 86% of the world, and that number's growing. But the majority of the world doesn't have access to healthcare. And I think this is a problem that we can solve with AI. The title for my talk was Delivering Clinical Care with AI, which I think a lot about, both as a scientist, but then also as a physician. And my talk is supposed to come off as encouraging, but not pessimistic. However, I really think that we don't deliver as a field, and I think that's a problem. Another thing that maybe people don't know about me is I'm an editor of our national journal for my subspecialty, which is neurosurgery. And in preparation for this talk, I was reading through old papers in our journal, and I came across this one from 1990. And you can see the title, Computer-Aided Intelligence, and this provides clinical decision support to physicians using an interactive dialogue between a user and a program. And if you go through this paper, you'll realize that it's computer-assisted diagnosis with a chatbot, interpretable feedback, that if I just threw ChatGPT into this paper, it could have been written yesterday. And this is 1990, over 35 years ago. So in many ways, in some sense, the field hasn't really changed for 35 years. We're still writing papers about chatbots and maybe not using them as much as we should. And I also wanted to kind of quantify that observation. And so we looked at, since 2020, almost 5,000 papers have been published on large language models in medicine. So not even AI, just large language models. And the overwhelming majority of these assess on multiple choice exams. And more on that in a second. In medicine, we have this notion of levels of evidence, levels of clinical evidence that we can use for taking care of our patients. And if we grade these papers using the criteria of healthcare, only 21 of these almost 5,000 studies have actually generated medical evidence. So let that sink in. We're writing a lot, but very little is even conceptually usable, much less actually used. So for on the topic of multiple choice questions, here's some work from one of the students in our lab, Shrutika Singh. And in the green, you can see the performance of various frontier models on multiple choice questions from the United States Medical License Exam. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these data sets. In the red, it's the performance of those models if you take those questions and make them free response. On the far right, you can see my medical students, very similar performance drop when you take away the multiple choice answers. The interesting experiment actually is, so these questions have a question stem, or the question text, and a bunch of answers. And if you start progressively masking out the question, you see these interesting trends. And so in the dotted lines at the bottom of the screen, this is the free response. And you can see that if we mask out on the x-axis here, the entirety of the question, so there's no question and no answer, that the accuracy is 0, as you would expect. There's nothing for the models to do. Interestingly, though, for the multiple choice questions, which are the solid lines, even when there is no question being asked, frontier models can get over 50% correct, which is really concerning. And it really suggests that in many of these cases, we're either memorizing in the training data or exploiting some prior over the answer choices, which is probably a little of both. But again, probably not the appropriate evaluation for using models in healthcare. And I'd like to point out that this isn't just a majority of papers in the field, even really high impact ones, very high profile ones, suffer from these basic faults in how they're used. This paper, for example, to pick on my former colleagues, the methods are fairly cursory. There's no public code, no public data. It was never actually used on a real patient. I would argue that works like this are both not reproducible, and it's still not used 5 years later and probably will never be used, which raises the question again of why are we considering this kind of work acceptable for healthcare? I include this as a joke, but I think it's relevant to this. So why don't we deliver? I think part of it is us. I'm a mathematician by training, turned to computer scientist, turned doctor. And I love math. I like the speed of AI research. But I think in healthcare, we have to get used to being slow. Because in healthcare, I think the major bottlenecks are really, some of it just defining our hypotheses, finding really clinically relevant hypotheses. More on that in a second. And then maybe just as importantly, it's building the infrastructure to support actually testing our tools in production. And then, of course, I think we all are familiar with, if we're in the healthcare space, there's a lot of regulation. And the regulations differ across territories and certainly across nations. Another one of the major problems, which in computer science and machine learning, we get to avoid a little bit, but in healthcare where we're thinking about using, always thinking about using real world data, there's a lot of data set shift. I could give a whole talk on data set shift, but I'd like to call out this particularly notable story about the EPIC sepsis model. This was an algorithm used to predict patients who have extreme infections. It was created by one of the leading electronic health record vendors, and it was actually run in production at one university where it had great results, but when they tested it at another one, you can see the AUC dropped to 0.64. Again, data set shift is a massive problem in healthcare, and it's very much underappreciated and understudied. Another area of data set shift, which I think is particularly pernicious, and this is work from one of my graduate students, Lavanya, is in just thinking about how we fundamentally design our test data sets. I think we're all used to generating a large data set. We sample it to create train, validation, and test splits. And we assume that our results on the test split will mirror our results in the real world. The problem in healthcare is that the real world is always changing. And I think COVID being a phenomenal example of this, where in a very short period of time, the distribution of diseases in our health systems and our societies radically shifted. And so to really properly test healthcare data, we need to have temporal splits of data that are actually distinct from the data that we used in training, again, to mirror that production use case. On that topic of time or longitudinal data, I think also one of the other major challenges or considerations in healthcare is what I say is sort of the misspecification of inputs. This is how we typically build computer vision data sets. We sample a bunch of images again, we find labels for them. Here I have 2 examples of head CTs. And we might say, well, the top one has some bleeding. There's some bleeding right here in the side. And this is someone who needs surgery. And the bottom one is a normal head CT, and this is someone who goes home. And this is how we normally build data sets. You could build algorithms, computer vision models. State-of-the-art computer vision models will probably get some very high score at predicting who needs surgery. And this is fundamentally wrong. Because the reality is that medicine happens in time, healthcare happens in time, and that the real probabilities here are actually completely conditional on the sequencing of the images. For example, this sequence is someone who goes home, as is this one, hemorrhage in both. It's only this ordering of events, which is surgery. So really, the conditional probability of needing surgery is not due to the images, but it's the ordering of them. Another particularly notable area of data set shift is in the priors, the prior distributions. Again, to pick on my former colleagues, this is a paper that came out recently, very exciting, on a chatbot that could actually talk to patients to make its diagnoses. AI physician of sorts. And in order to test this, they had patient actors pretend to be patients based on these scripts, and they had real physicians and the chatbot interact with them and try to come up with a diagnosis. And this is the major take-home figure for the manuscript. You see the AI is better than primary care physicians. But there's some big issues with the priors behind this data set. One, I'd like to point out, is that in these simulated cases, the almost 150 cases have a disease. Usually in primary care, those numbers are inverted. Most people, fortunately, don't have serious illnesses. Whereas here, the probability of prior probability of disease is 94%. Maybe even more concerning about this work is that, again, if you dig into the data itself, the prior probability diseases are radically artificial and not common to how we see them in the real world. For example, tuberculosis in this data set has a 20% prevalence. In the real world, again, fortunately, it's 0.0025%. Most physicians will never see a case of tuberculosis in their career. So the fact that it's 20% of the test set really calls into question what we're actually comparing against and what these results actually mean. Similarly, for example, pulmonary embolism, 30% versus 0.1%. And I can go through the rest of the data set here. Neurological diseases, low back pain isn't present in the data set at all. It's actually about 30% of real-world neurological complaints, and it's actually the second most common reason people go to the emergency department. Many of us probably have low back pain in the audience, not present in the test set. So, I mean, again, it really calls into question what's being evaluated and the quality of the evaluations. So, after that brief note of pessimism, I think, so what are some of the ways forwards? So, fortunately, again, my graduate student Lavender's done some phenomenal work in this regards. And I think one, again, is really rethinking the hypotheses, the clinical hypotheses that we're asking. And maybe moving away from, can we do diagnoses better, which hopefully I've shown that just thinking about competing with doctors on diagnoses has all of these pitfalls. But maybe simple tasks that we need in the course of running our health system. How do we help people figure out what they're going to pay on their bill? Very practical if you're seeking healthcare. How long are you going to be in the hospital? Again, if you're a patient, you want to know how long you're in the hospital. If you're running a hospital, you need to know how long people are there because it's like running a hotel. You have limited beds. And I think on these practical problems, which Lavanya built in this data set called Remedy, we found that if you train very small language models on these very specific purpose-built tasks, that they actually compete pretty favorably against frontier models. And in all cases are much more performant, which again, kind of makes sense. These are sorts of tasks that while they're part and parcel in the basic function of healthcare, they're not represented in data sets anywhere outside of the health domain. And again, I think it's encouraging. We've heard a few talks today already about how do academics maybe compete with universities or compete with large industry groups? And this is an area, I think, in healthcare where the data is a major bottleneck for industry groups, but also, again, I think one of the speakers even mentioned last session, the domain expertise. I think another big thing we can do in academia is just commit to prod and actually take these things into the real world. So Lavanya, again, did this with her work. We found that in a prospective cohort study, that if we had a model that could predict 30-day readmissions, that was trained on our in-domain data and tested and run in our health system, that for every 100 readmissions, it could predict 61% of the patients who were unplanned as a readmission, and many of these patients actually ended up needing further medical treatment. 20 had an adverse event or death. Another example of why I think it's so critical to not just to actually take these things and test them in the real world. We have a project called NYU Obsidian. And again, I won't go into the details, you can read the paper, but here we trained a 34 billion parameter vision language model using some bespoke medical content from a medical journal. And doing what we normally do in machine learning, we tested it on multiple choice questions, and we compared to frontier models, and we showed that, yes, on in-domain data, it works comparably to, I think here, Claude is what we're comparing against. But again, does this really matter? So we actually took to running a blinded, randomized controlled trial of this. We took the system, we deployed it on an inference platform, we created a web app, and we put it in the hands of doctors and had them turned them loose in the hospital to use the chatbot as they saw patients as a diagnostic co-pilot. And so over a 3-month trial, we randomized doctors between GPT-4o1 and our model Obsidian. And over the course of that, about 70 patients were randomized, half to GPT-4o1, half to Obsidian. We demonstrated in the trial that, again, on the in-domain, the patients, the model was trained on our patients, so really in-domain testing against GPT-4o1, that our model was non-inferior. However, and this is why it's so important to actually run things, I think the most interesting observation is that during that time period, almost 1,000 patients were seen by those doctors. And the doctors only used the co-pilot 7% of the time. So the real conclusion of the randomized controlled trial isn't that we built this model some way and it's not inferior, is that physicians hate chatbots. And there's a problem with the fundamental user interface. And this is something that you will only find if you actually deploy what you're building. So I really think that we need to rethink, in many ways though, kind of reflect on the trial, that's uniquely enabled by the infrastructure in order to do that, to both train the model, but more importantly, to actually deploy it and put it in users' hands in a clinical trial. And I think the way we need to redo this then is really, especially in the healthcare space, is rethinking our institutional infrastructures to enable this kind of research. So my quote, which I'll have more to say on this tomorrow for anyone attending the workshop, is I think for medical AI researchers, great researchers study logistics. And fundamentally, we need to rethink some of our IT systems to enable this sort of work. So at NYU, we've built and are in the process of building several institutional teams to help enable this kind of research. These are 3 of them. And some of the things that we managed to do with this over the past year, which again, I'll have more to say about this tomorrow, is build several large, massive multimodal data sets. This one's NYU METS. This is actually publicly available on AWS. And it's about 1,500 patients, 16,000 MRI scans, longitudinal, of patients with brain tumors, which we've open sourced. Similarly, we built the NYU Q&A over the past year. This is 10 million text messages between patients and their physicians. It's the world's largest non-commercial data set of any text messages, but these are between doctors and patients. And lastly, a collaboration with Dr. Chopra, we've been putting together the Thoracle, which is one of the world's largest multimodal data sets of thoracic imaging. So over 10 million chest x-rays, 1 million CTs, and it has paired medical data, again, longitudinal electronic health records, as well as medicines. So in conclusion, it's not really about the AI or the computers, it's about the patients and the people. And I think in healthcare, really, despite knowing how hard many of these things are, especially the evaluations and the benchmarking, there's an incredible opportunity here that we really need to embrace by getting things out and getting things deployed. So thank you, and I should have some time for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Oermann, for an enlightening talk. I mean, I could not agree more with your message, by the way. So any questions?
Hello, Dr. Oermann. I'm Suji Lei from Kyunghee University Medical School, and it was really honored to hear your session. And by the way, as you told us that the smaller and targeted element would be more accurate because the model would be influenced by the trained data set, right? And then I think because every country or every hospital, the data set or the characteristic of the patient would be really different. So you mean that each country or each hospital need the different type of LLM. So it could be really difficult to be generalized. So I have a question like how the future of those kind of LLMs you have suggested.
Awesome. Same. I think I've had this my career as a computer scientist. I think I've gone from these aspirations over AGI, the model that works everywhere, to really embracing the silos and just saying that in some sense, I don't care if, especially as a doctor, like I don't care if my model doesn't work anywhere else. If it works for my patients in front of me and delivers a clinical benefit, that's the win.
Any more questions? I guess I'll ask one. Essentially the deficiencies of these papers published in high-profile journals like Nature that you pointed out. The trouble is that this has been happening since, like, it's not a recent phenomena, right? Like, I mean, I don't know if you remember the dermatology paper that came out of Stanford a while ago, almost 10 years ago, also had a similar issue. They said that, oh, we've solved dermatology and we have an AI model that is as good as like a specialized dermatologist. And all they were doing was basically, the model was detecting the image of a ruler inside the image, like inside the dermatology images, and primarily because the data set was flawed. So this has been happening, and this is a pattern that is prevalent in healthcare, primarily because there are so many confounding variables which most people do not take into account. I guess my question is, how do you fundamentally fix this issue? Not necessarily, I guess from a research standpoint is one question. There's also this question of publication, right? Like whosoever is reviewing these papers is obviously green-lighting them without thinking these things. I wonder if there's a way to set up a process that can at least have some sort of a gating mechanism to make sure that such papers, which can potentially be harmful, it's not like detecting cats versus dogs, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think as I always come back to infrastructure, and I think as a community, clearly the answer is that to really evaluate these things, they actually need to get run in production and then used in a real environment. I think certainly when I think of like medical research, we would never use anything on patients that wasn't actually demonstrated to work in actual patients. Yet we seem to have a lower bar for AI tools, and I think part of it is a little bit of laziness. I think also it is partially, it's so hard to get things deployed in production and actually used that I think we collectively get together and say, all right, we'll lower the bar for publication, because we all know it's too much to ask people to really use this or really test this. And I think we need to, I think maybe as a community, maybe again, spirit like open source, really open sourcing, what are the solutions that we can come with together to enable that kind of testing and deployment. And that can be, and a lot of it's really boring stuff, because a lot of it's not even, certainly some of it's, software infrastructure. For us, we have a code base that we use to deploy our models. It's built on top of Kubernetes and VLLM. But I think some of it's really the boring stuff, like the institutional review board protocols, the data sharing agreements, just the paperwork. And I think if we could open source some of those, that would hopefully lower that bar to actually getting stuff deployed. And maybe we'd see more of that, and maybe then we'd be willing to enforce kind of a higher standard of evaluation.
Gotcha. Great. Let's thank Dr. Oermann once again for an excellent talk. And our last speaker is Dr. Lavanya Umapathy, who's a postdoc at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. And she'll be talking about context is everything. So please give her a round of applause. Thank you.
Perfect. Hello, everybody. I'm Lavanya Umapathy. I'm a postdoctoral fellow with the Center for Advanced Imaging Innovation and Research at NYU Langone. And today I will talk about context is everything, reducing false positives in longitudinal health assessment using deep learning with prior information. In this era of AI, everything is personalized for you. Your reading list, your Netflix watch list, podcasts, restaurant recommendations, and many more. The AI algorithms behind these systems not only use population-level information, but also your personal history to make these decisions. Now, what about personalization in healthcare? Every year, billions of patients are assessed for suspected diseases. Yet, by and large, their care hinges on decisions made from single-visit snapshots without detailed knowledge of their individual clinical trajectories. Now, medical risk prediction models do little to change this. They optimize visit-by-visit accuracy rather than patient level. Again, the focus is on high sensitivity so we can detect diseases early, diseases like cancers, while they are still curable. Now, the illustration on the right gives a good overview of the delicate balance between sensitivity and specificity. We want our models to have high sensitivity so we can detect diseases early in patients who have it. We also want the model to have high specificity so we could rule out the disease in populations that do not have the disease. As we move that decision threshold to the left, we get high sensitivity, but that comes at the expense of poor specificity. Now, this becomes challenging as the current healthcare landscape transitions from reactive health to proactive health. There is increased focus on personalized preventative health as there's been a rise in longitudinal monitoring approaches for screening and surveillance of diseases in, let's say, prostate cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, and so on. However, such proactive screening approaches are known to carry a risk of overdiagnosis and overtreatment as a result of limited specificity of these screening tests, especially when it's applied to patient populations that have a low a priori risk of disease. So this resulting high burden of false positive findings leads to unnecessary clinical interventions. Maybe you get an extra MRI, maybe a biopsy. Leads to prolonged patient anxiety and inefficient use of healthcare resources. Now, false positives are also a major challenge and an obstacle to population-wide screening efforts. If in longitudinal follow-up, you are repeatedly raised as a false flag for high risk of disease, people might lose faith in longitudinal monitoring and may decline potentially life-saving follow-up. There is therefore a need for approaches which can limit these false positive findings, particularly in patients with low prevalence of disease, without compromising the sensitivity of disease detection. So we hypothesize that with suitable incorporation of diverse, individualized context, we can drive down false positive rates, increase specificity, without compromising on high sensitivity. Now, I talked about context. What is context? And I will talk about this in the perspective of medical imaging because that's what I do. Now, at first glance, not very much. We generate our tomographic images, for example, slice by slice using raw data that comes out of the scanner. But actually, there is abundant and diverse context. We have anatomical context, multiple contrasts coming out from our scanners. Then we have context from images that come from other devices, CT, PET, SPECT. We also have sensors that are connected to these devices that measure physiological responses. And then don't forget the context from electronic health records. We have all of this from one point in time, but we also have context over time. Now, we usually have tunnel vision. We are only focused on looking at data from one specific point in time. And we are good with spatial context, but we still have a lot to learn about time. So how do we leverage this context of time? For this, we proposed a context-aware risk refinement model to reduce false positives without sacrificing sensitivity by integrating a patient's prior clinical and/or imaging history to improve risk assessment. Now, this is relevant because you may have a variable number of monitoring sessions per patient. The interval between the sessions might be variable, and the data collected across the sessions could be diverse. Sometimes you may have imaging data, other times you may have clinical data, biopsies, and so on. And we applied this to predicting the risk of clinically significant prostate cancer. Prostate cancer is the most common cancer in men. And according to statistics from the American Cancer Society, it is the second leading cause of cancer death in American men, with almost 313,000 new cases estimated so far this year. Now, routine care for prostate cancer yields rich longitudinal context, which is great to train this AI model. Now, screening for prostate cancer starts with measuring PSA levels, prostate-specific antigen, in the blood, or using DRE. If your PSA levels are high, you may be recommended for radiologic imaging with an MRI. And if your MRI has suspicious findings, you may be recommended for biopsies. So the screening and diagnostic pathways for prostate cancer often generate false positives or false flags that result in unnecessary biopsies. And biopsies are painful, invasive procedures that have well-documented risks. So to train our model, we began collecting this massive data set of clinical and imaging biomarkers for patients who were imaged at NYU Langone for known or suspected prostate cancer. And we looked at the time frame between 2015 and 2023. This included more than 28,000 men. We collected over 39,000 MRI exams and 68,000 blood tests for PSA from this population. And here's the MRI-based risk stratification. Now, radiologists look at these MR images, assign a score from 1 to 5, where 1 is no risk, 5 is very high risk of prostate cancer. And almost like 23% of our population were flagged as high risk for prostate cancer. Now next, I talked about data. Now let's talk about what models to use. So when thinking about what kind of models do we use, we were guided by our observations of how human clinicians analyze prior context. Now, when we have longitudinal data for a patient and a patient comes in for a visit, clinicians often assess the most recent snapshot of a patient's health, either imaging or clinical data, to estimate a baseline risk of disease based on population context. They then use any available prior data to refine this original risk estimate. So what do I mean by that? Oh, there you go. So let's look at an example of prostate MRI from a patient from 2 different points in time. So the different columns that you see are different contrast images from an MRI scanner for that patient. We have data for the current visit in the bottom and data from a prior visit. Now, if a clinician notices that the imaging features over time are stable between the current and the prior visit, then the risk of prostate cancer associated with the current visit may remain the same or may even be downgraded because the changes are stable. If, however, the current visit looked like this, there is a suspicious lesion since prior visit, then the risk of prostate cancer is upgraded because there's been a change that is worrisome. So such an approach of risk refinement is highly flexible. It inherently incorporates key general knowledge about the temporal evolution of the disease without placing any particular constraints on temporal sampling. So we therefore chose to base our automated risk assessment approach on this model of progressive risk refinement. So here's prostate MR images from a current visit. Our model consists of a representation learner that looks at this prostate MRI from the current visit and transforms them into a low-dimensional latent representation that summarizes the risk of prostate cancer associated with that exam. A risk estimation model looks at this representation and predicts the current and 5-year risk of prostate cancer. So far, this looks like any other risk assessment framework. Now, what if this patient also had prostate MRI exams from previous visits, maybe one prior or multiple priors? So the representation learner takes this longitudinal history of prostate MR images and transforms them into a sequence of representations. Now, a temporal learner looks at risk evolution across these representations that were collected over time to generate a change signal. And this change signal tells our risk refinement, do we upgrade our initial assessment or do we downgrade our initial assessment? Now, this is a very general framework. I showed an example of how it works with current images and prior images. You could also replace it with clinical data, which we did. We used PSA values, age, and prostate volume from the patient from a current visit and prior visits. It can also be applied to multimodal framework, which we also did when we have images from the current visit and you have prior history of clinical data and prior history of imaging data. And we used progressive risk refinement. We upgraded our risk based on imaging priors and then upgraded or downgraded our risk based on clinical priors. So I said that our representation learner transforms high-dimensional prostate MR images into a low-dimensional risk representation space. So let's look at what representations our model learns. And for this, I visualize this prostate MR learned risk representation space using t-SNE. So here's a visualization of representations from almost 2,500 prostate MR images. And we randomly selected 500 samples from each of the different PIRATS categories, 1 to 5. And you can see these representations are color-coded by the risk scores. So the red and the green are PIRATS 1 and 2, represent low risk, and the purple and blue are the high risk. And you can see the representation learner already sorted the data into a low-risk region, where the PIRATS 1 and 2 reside, and a high-risk region, where the PIRATS 4 and 5 reside. Luckily for us, for these patients, we also had associated biopsy outcomes, where you take a sample from the prostate, a pathologist looks at it, and assigns a Gleason score that measures the aggressiveness of prostate cancer. So when we looked at the associated biopsy outcomes, they correlated really well. The representations in the low-risk region were associated with benign biopsies or negative biopsies, which is great. Now let's look at what happens when we integrate prior context into risk prediction. So here's the performance of our model in predicting the risk of prostate cancer associated with the time of the visit, and we're only using the current MR exam. So here I use the combination of false negatives and true positives to show sensitivity of the model, which was 93%, which is great. And I used the combination of false positives and true negatives to denote the specificity of the model. The specificity was 49%, which means our false positive rate was 51%. We were incorrectly flagging 51% of people for high risk of prostate cancer, even though they didn't have it. Now that's a problem. So let's see what happens when we add information from one prior MRI exam. The true positives stay the same. The false positives go down from 51 to 46%. We add information from two prior MRI visits for the patients. False positives go down further. We add 3 priors. They go down further from 51 to 33%. Now, we only added prior imaging history. Let's throw in clinical history as well. So for clinical history, we used PSA, prostate volume, and age information from the patient from the current visit and from the first visit. And you can see we were able to bring down the false positives by half, from 51% all the way down to 24%, without it letting affect our sensitivity. I really like this surface plot, which kind of summarizes our entire research in one slide. On one axis, you see specificity, given by 1 minus the false positive rate. The second axis is the number of priors. That's the amount of information that you're giving your model as context. The third axis is what kind of context is it? Is it clinical context, imaging context, or it's the combination? And as you can see, whether it was clinical, imaging, or multimodal, the more context you had, the higher your specificity was. And the more diverse your context was, specificity increased further. So context is everything. Let's go over our key takeaways from this. So we looked at a risk steering approach, which assesses initial risk based on the most recent exam and leverages temporal context gleaned from imaging or prior clinical biomarkers to refine this risk assessment. And what we observed was systematically incorporating temporal context into AI-based medical risk prediction models reduced false positives. And this behavior was consistent regardless of the kind of data we used, whether it was imaging or clinical or multimodal. So what does this mean? If we can bring down the false positive rates sufficiently low enough so that they are lower than the prevalence of disease in the general population, we could enable longitudinal health monitoring for broader populations. The second key takeaway is false positive rates are not inherent to any given imaging or clinical test, although all population-based medical screening effectively operates on this premise. And what we observed was suitable incorporation of individualized context, whether it was temporal or multimodal, can reduce these rates substantially and progressively. So let's go back to the question I asked in the first slide. What about personalization in healthcare? So we can detect diseases early, we can be much more effective in curing them, and we can do all of this without raising false warning flags. So the more we see you, the better we can predict your health. So that concludes this presentation, and I look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thanks, Lavanya, for a great talk. Questions? We have a couple of minutes for questions before we start the panel discussion.
The jet lag's kicking in.
Thank you for the great talk. I was curious on how the risk estimates are calculated. Let's say that someone goes into to get tests. They don't have cancer, but they have somewhat, for example, like medically proved to have a system that is that have like a higher chance of getting cancer, but this person never got cancer in the end. Like, are they included in the risk estimation? Like, yeah.
So this is all the population. So this is not applied to the general population. This is anyone who was ever imaged at NYU Langone. So these are people who either had known cancer, or they had suspicion for cancer, or they were screened for cancer. So what would be really nice is to see how this applies to general population, which is the end goal, to bring down the false positives so we can apply these models to general population without raising false warning flags. As for how the risk assessment is calculated, they're all based on MRI exams. So every time someone comes in for an MRI, the radiologist looks at it, assesses it, gives it a score from 1 to 5. So 1 is like no cancer, 2 is low risk, 3 is ambiguous, 4 is high, and 5 is very high risk of cancer. So radiologists have a really high positive predictive value. When they call something 4 or 5, the chances of it being cancer is very high. And if anyone who's 3 or above undergoes a biopsy, and the biopsy is kind of like the ground truth of whether or not someone actually has cancer. Although I would say there's sampling errors and stuff, but that's how risk is calculated. So our goal was to see if we could look at someone's MRI or clinical data, because I didn't show those results, but we also have a clinical-only model that uses just the clinical variables and prior clinical data to predict if someone would have a high risk of prostate cancer or not. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Makes sense.
Cool. Any more questions? Cool, then. I guess let's thank the speaker once again.
Thank you so much.
That concludes our talk. So I will start with the panel discussion now. So if I could request all the speakers and, in addition, Professor Ki-Soo Kim to come on stage for the panel discussion. I guess we can start. So since we have somewhat of a disconnected topic, I'll try to ask questions that are resonating to both the set of populations. So I'll start with a straight up question which applies to everyone actually. So something that I always am curious about in any field, which is, what do you think is going well in your field right now in terms of research, and what is not going well? Other than the fact that the problems that you mentioned, in your case data, in Eric's case poor science, I would say. But other than that, what else is not going well? So, and what's going well?
So I guess we'll start from here and then go, okay.
Yes.
Just checking if the mic's working. All right. So I think the thing that's going well is a lot of interest, right? There's lots of dollars being poured into robotics and humanoid stuff right now. So I think that's definitely good. Not sure if general purpose robotics will be solved, but at least we'll make a lot of progress with that. So I think in terms of what's good, just the interest and incentives behind it is great. In terms of what's not going well is I think most folks in robot AI are focusing on a very narrow way of solving it, right? Like there are a few things that work and everyone's trying to scale on those few things that work. But I think there are many other types of problems, including things like human data, including multi-fingered hands, including the sense of touch that is actually needed to scale. So yeah, I think we'll see a lot of that as well in the next few years. Yeah.
And from method standpoint, you think, like, I mean, I know that you said that the data is an issue, but like from a method standpoint, you think we are there yet?
Yeah, I think methods, I actually don't know. There's, with some amount of scale of data, maybe it'll work. But right now, for the amount of data we have, it clearly seems insufficient, the type of algorithms we're using in robotics, at least. I do think we have to get closer and closer to things that, Jan talks about, like world models, reasoning. I think we have to get closer towards that. But there are challenges there as well. So I think there's definitely a lot of space to work on algorithms. It's just that I'm not sure which ones. Yeah.
Yeah. So in my opinion, what is going well is imitation learning for robot-specific data is going pretty well, I think. Now, given that we have paired observation-action data sets, I think we have a lot of great architectures that learns pretty generalizable and also like a long horizon tasks. But I think what is not going necessarily well is I think community is not thinking about tasks and the way we can improve the tasks that we have. And I think like there are multiple branches. There is generalizability, dexterity, a long horizonness, dynamicness of the tasks. And I think we have a lot of push towards generalizability. But for low-level, accurate, high-frequency control, that is also generalizable, I think is still a work in progress. And this is like something that is not necessarily, we don't have data for these problems right now that is existing. So like I think that needs improvement.
Eric?
I was going to say, I've been thinking also about the combination of robotics and healthcare, and I do think there's a certain degree of, historically it's a little painful to get data in both these areas. Maybe that's our unified theme. But I think also it's encouraging that I think in both areas we're seeing a lot of solutions come out with the ways that you all have been able to scale your ability to generate data. And I think in healthcare, there's just slow but growing efforts to democratize access to de-identified data, to share data. So I do think the data access issues are getting better. I think certainly, I guess the other commonality is there's definitely a lot of commercial interest. There's a lot of money in healthcare AI also. So I think the level of interest is going well, but I think the data is also getting better, maybe in both areas. But I think certainly still the ability to scalably evaluate maybe systems in both cases is still a major challenge, but for very different reasons in this case. Rather than healthcare, I think it's mostly the regulatory complexity of getting into deployment. Then also, of course, the stakes in healthcare are very high in many cases. I think maybe one other similarity I can think of is I know Casey and I did a project a while ago where we both just used our health data. So there's sort of a DIY element that some investigators use to solve the data issue, which you also have a big DIY element with little grabber claw. So yeah, I think mostly data, financing, but still evaluation is hard.
I guess I would say data too. There's two perspectives. Being at a medical center helps because there's a lot of data. It's a big health enterprise, so any kind of risk prediction model you want to develop, you have enough data to learn population context, so we have data for that. What we don't have is learning longitudinal context, having longitudinal data. Again, we had enough data, I would say sufficient data, but not everybody has. So it goes back to data sharing and how we can make these longitudinal data sets available to everybody, because what is publicly available is still single visit data. We do not have enough longitudinal data sets to learn how do we use context or how do we use the component of time to improve our assessments. The second part that is missing, at least for what I'm working on, is clinical trials to see the actual deployment of these models into the population that needs it, because we may have a model that on the test set has 90% sensitivity, has like 76% specificity. That's great, but we want to know when we actually deploy these models to populations that need them, can we avoid those biopsies? Can we avoid those treatments that are unnecessary? So that right now is missing, and these things take time, as Eric pointed out.
Yeah, well, actually, I have a lot of challenges, the data as well. I think, just my opinion, open data set to the public has much imbalance. So when you develop AI models, it's quite hard to overcome the imbalance problems. And also, when we develop some AI models, we need to compare with the previous models, but sometimes it's hard to directly compare because we don't know the labels. They open the data, but we don't know the labels, and we don't know what data was used for the training and the test. This is one of the challenges. Yeah, and also just very specific in the MRI field. When we reconstruct the MR images from undersampled data, I still doubt how we can trust the results, because the AI model can reconstruct images very well from the undersampled data, but when we extremely increase the undersampling rate, it can also still reconstruct it, but if there is some small disease, the reasons, it's hard to reconstruct that. So I'm still trying to develop this kind of techniques.
Gotcha.
Actually, I have a question for the robotics folks. I feel like, at least in my day-to-day, the one place where I do see a lot of robotics is in healthcare. Especially, I know in our hospital we have little robots that carry samples and kind of scoot around. I guess I was thinking maybe two questions. Generally, what do you think about robotics in healthcare? And then more specifically, like, why do you think that specific use case actually seems to be somewhat prevalent?
So I think from the examples I think the robotics that I at least observed in healthcare has been either for robots that are So okay, like I think hardware that enables these sort of like small surgeries that is used in healthcare, I think is getting more and more robust, but making them autonomous is so much more harder, I think, like than right now how it is used. As far as I know, it is mostly used by teleoperating and like that is controlled. So the autonomy is still dependent on the human. Whereas I think like making them autonomous is going to be very, very, very difficult and very far away, I think, from where we are. But yeah, I think that's my comment. It's not really a response to your question, but I think that's my comment.
Yeah, and maybe to add on what Irmak said, right? If you think about autonomy, certain aspects of autonomy are easier. So if you think about like self-driving, right? If you've been to San Francisco, you're seeing these Waymo cars driving around. So the similar sort of technology can be put on small mobile robots that can move samples from A to B inside a hospital flow. So that type of autonomy is close to being a solved problem. But if you think about increasing the level of capability where you want to go beyond sort of just moving around on a 2D floor, and now, manipulating objects, actually physically, picking up objects, putting it inside a bin, or doing more dexterous tasks, that gets harder and harder, right? So again, I think there's a gap between what robots can do in a teleoperated way, where you sort of embody yourself in the robot and do something, and what you can do in an autonomous way, where there's an AI model controlling that. And so it's complicated. It's a complicated sort of dynamic there. Yeah.
I also have one more commentary on the things that are lacking in the field. I would like to echo what Eric was saying about lack of evaluation in robotics as well. I think there is a big gap between how we evaluate our models in lab setups compared to how they will be deployed in real world and how we want to deploy them, which I think we can think about ways to how to unify them and bridge them together as well.
Okay, I just have a quick question, follow-up. When you were talking about the autonomous robots for surgeries, would there be regulatory restrictions? Would you want a human to control it, or would you want a robot to be autonomous when doing procedures? It's for you. Yeah.
Certainly those would be regulated. I think this stands for most things in healthcare. We have a regulatory frameworks already in place for both robotics, but also for things that are directly therapeutic, be they pharmaceutical agents or devices. So I think it would fall still within the existing regulatory frameworks. I think also, though, there's certainly there's the regulatory element to it, and also somewhat the patient element to it. And I think I know that there was actually a great paper a few months ago which surveyed patients internationally about how they felt about AI in healthcare, and I think overwhelmingly the respondents said that they were interested in their doctors using AI to help us treat them, but very negative about AI being the primary point of interaction.
Cool. I guess moving on to the next question, and that's for folks in robotics. Is embodiment actually necessary in robotics, or is it like a distraction? Related to my question to, my earlier question, that why exactly do we need humanoids? Why not just have a robot that, even if you're working for a general purpose robot, why not have something that is does not look like a human? Think of airplanes, right? They don't look like birds. The goal was to make people fly, but not. So build hardware that does the task rather than resemble something that is in nature.
Yeah, a great question. I think this is one of the fundamental things that divide roboticists, which is should you work on humanoid robots or not? So okay, instead of first giving my opinion, I'm going to sort of lay out what the arguments on each side are, right? So if you have a problem, the solution to the problem can be very much non-human, right? So if you look at like how your phone is being made, there are these massive like 9-foot tall robot arms that are just like moving at superhuman speeds in order to make the price point of these phones reasonable for us to buy them, right? And so I think that's the argument on that side, that if you have a given problem, you can hyper-optimize that problem and like find a good solution for it. Okay. Now, on the other side of things, the people who are proponents of humanoids are all about generalization. So there the focus is not about a machine, it's not about creating a machine that can do one thing really well, but the goal is to create a machine that can do many, many things sort of well, right? So if you think about like house aid, if someone has to come to your house, clean it up, do all the laundry, do all the chores in the house, it's hard to imagine like a machine at a price point that can do that for you, which is why a lot of the humanoid companies are also focusing on homes, right? So it's all about like, do you care about solving a specific task amazingly well, or do you care about solving a range of tasks?
No, but I'll push back on that as well, right? Like you could still have a machine that does general tasks but does not look like a human. For instance, if you want a home robot, why does it need to walk on 2 legs? Why can't it be on a skateboard or a wheel, like, or a bunch of wheels, which will be much faster and easily to maneuver? And likewise for fingers, why does it need to have like 3 fingers or 5? Why not like 10? Why just 2 arms? Why not 10 arms?
Yeah, great questions. Yeah, so the usual, again, I'm sort of laying out what the usual arguments over here are, right? So for legs, right? Yeah, sure. Inside a home, if you're all flat, New York apartments, totally understand it. But like, if you see all the videos of like the fancy humanoid companies, they always put their robots in some like rich Bay Area house with like 3 floors, and it has to climb up multiple set of stairs to get from the bedroom to the living room, right? So I think there are ways in which you want to portray this. Like legs are great for going upstairs. Legs are great if you're outside on a terrain. But I think for most environments, it's clear that you do not need legs. Just being on wheels is fine. So that argument I buy. I think the hand argument, I think on the hand side, I do believe that the human form factor for hands is better, just because of the objects that we build, right? The things that are in the world have all been created for our hands to manipulate it. So sure, a subset of them can work well with 2-fingered hands. I think that's clear. Like you can do a lot of things with these 2-fingered hands, but they hit limitations. Like there are like a bunch of companies focused just on 2-fingered hands, and it seems like the most impressive task they can do is like folding towels or folding clothes, right? But like if you have to grab something heavy and move it around, that's like one of the first places where like 2-fingered hands start to break down. So yeah, I think it's a nuanced argument. I think the core central question is, what is your goal, right? Is the goal to solve one specific thing? Is the goal to solve a general things? And then when you say general, like what's that regime of generality you want to solve? I think from that, it's very easy to make an argument for, oh, do you need legs? Do you not need legs? Do you need hands? Do you not need hands? Do you need 2 arms? Do you need 5 arms, right? I think these are all like important questions that we have to answer as the technology gets more and more mature. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I think I strongly agree with the like a chain of thought of, if you want generalizable, then we rely on data. If you want to use data that is existing, then we sort of somewhat rely on human form factor. But I also think that if we really want to, I don't know, think out of the box and like think about how the robots might look like 50 years from now on, like for example, if we had tiny flying robots that can just maybe we have 1,000 tiny flying robots that just moves objects around, and somewhat we have perfect modeling of the world, then the robot form factor can be very different of what we think of right now. but I think we're still at a state where we can only think about trade-offs that we make. And I think like with the trade-offs that we have, human form factor makes more sense, because all of our, like, the way to generalize is right now by using data that we have. And I think with this setup, using human form factor makes sense. With also hardware technology that we have.
Cool. I guess switching on to healthcare, so I have a question regarding LLMs. There's been obviously quite a lot of buzz around LLMs being applied to healthcare in every which way, right? Do you see any issue in that, in the sense that do you really believe that they're understanding the medicine? And if obviously if they're not understanding the medicine, then like how would you go about it? Like, are you comfortable applying them to safety critical applications? Like one of Eric, your talk, one plot you showed where you basically, if you remove the question, like 100% of the question, and still the LLM is doing better than a chance. Obviously it is, like, pardon my French, it's bullshitting. So obviously it's not understanding anything, right? So does that concern you with so many people working on essentially or laying their bets in this space for healthcare?
I think certainly there's a lot of concerning points that you bring up. I'm actually still very, despite my talk being somewhat negative, I feel like I often, especially as a reviewer of articles, tend to be very negative. But I'm actually quite positive about the use of all these technologies in healthcare. But I think for me, I really draw that line at the point of evaluation. And because there's actually already a great precedent for this. There's a ton of things in healthcare that are routinely used by doctors and patients accept, maybe even love in some cases, and we have no idea how they work. Like some very common medicines. No clue how they work, but we use it all the time because they've been rigorously validated in clinical trials. And so to me, I think all these AI technologies, that's kind of where why I think it's so important that we get to actually using them and actually evaluating them the way we evaluate other medical technologies, because to some extent, if they've been proven using accepted standards that they do deliver a benefit to patients, maybe it doesn't matter how they work, as long as we've really demonstrated that patients benefit.
But that's the trouble with LLMs, right? It's hard to evaluate their free-form output unless like you're actually going through the whole thing end to end.
True, exactly. Well, I think again, it's evaluate, when we think of like evaluating in a trial or some formalized study, we're looking at not just the technology, but the technology used in a certain way, following certain criteria by doctors in a certain patient population. So it's really that system as a whole. I think, and I think until you do that, you can get some deeply counterintuitive results. One of my favorite stories is one of my friends is the CEO of a radiology AI startup, and they developed a system that could help doctors predict strokes on CAT scans. And a big deal, strokes need to get treated rapidly, and they can be hard to see on CAT scans. And so they developed this technology which was really, really sensitive. You want to be sensitive, but there's strokes. And they sold it to radiologists as this is a way of making your workflows go faster because it's going to surface the strokes to the top and then push all the normal ones to the bottom. And what happened was actually when they rolled this out, that it actually had the opposite effect on radiologists. It actually slowed them down because what was happening was this very sensitive algorithm would throw a lot of false positives. And then radiologists would say, wait a minute, I read this and it looks normal, but the AI says there's a stroke. I can't afford to miss that. I better go back and reread it again.
Interesting. Lavanya, your thoughts?
I was very happy when he said false positives. That's my entire research. How do we bring down the false positives? But I guess if someone's coming for the first time, you wouldn't have prior context about them, so it's tricky.
Doctor.
Actually, I have a short question to Eric. So when the AI assists some clinicians, decision with LLM models. How do you think how to avoid the hallucination from the LLM when they decide something, when they make decisions, and how we can, I just wonder how we deal with hallucination from the LLM.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's about the systems in which these tools are used. Often we see, for the models that are currently being used, they provide clinical decision support. So to some extent, doctors are your safeguard against hallucinations or any other kind of failure points. But again, I really think it's important, though, to study these actually used in the wild as part of some system, because you could see hallucinations causing doctors to maybe slow down or maybe make wrong decisions. So it really does need to get trialed actually in the wild.
Thank you.
I have another question for you. So in terms of like evaluating how good these LLMs are, right? There should be like a time budget, I'm assuming, where it's like, okay, there's like, I don't know, 1 hour, and how many sort of right answers do you sort of get on it, right? And so do you see that this helps, right? Because if, looking at potential false positives that may have, been like a true positive, it could be better, right? It could overall be a better thing than not, right? Because you can imagine like a doctor that just looks at everything and be like, there's no stroke, and then spends very little time on it. So yeah, I'm curious on your thoughts on how you evaluate these types of systems as well.
And for us, I think our trial kind of demonstrated that point, that for us, for our randomized controlled trial, we specifically gave it to consultant surgical residents, so senior trainees who were seeing new patients for acute neurological issues. So they were under a strict time budget, and consequently, they just didn't use the diagnostic co-pilot. They just said, we don't have time in order to do this. I think we could have run the same trial, but in maybe like an outpatient clinic, where maybe like an outpatient clinic, I don't know, for something like allergies, where there was a lot less of a time constraint, and you would have seen a very different system utilization. So but again, I think, to me, it keeps on coming back to how do we actually evaluate these tools in real-world environments, because sometimes you'll see profoundly counterintuitive results.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
So wouldn't this mean that the regulation system here is deeply broken? Because like, it seems like if you want a human at the end of the day to always make a decision, and they just don't have time, and there are not enough doctors, that just makes such a strong argument to like having another system where, okay, if there's no doctor, at least this AI system is telling you something, right?
Totally, but to me, I kind of analogize to self-driving cars. I think in that space, we've seen the regulatory environment loosen enough to actually start getting cars onto the streets, and I think increasingly people are realizing, hey, maybe there is a safety benefit to some systems used in a certain way. And I do think that the end game for healthcare will probably be something similar, where someday, maybe some years from now, we'll say, why isn't your doctor using some AI technology? Or why would you see a human first when you could go to the AI? Like, I think we'll get there. I think, as we all know, regulations evolve slowly and kind of, they catch up with technology rather than leading it. But I do think, at least in the United States, I think the US FDA is actually cognizant of this, and I think we are starting to see the regulatory environment move towards enabling these systems is the one thing. And the second one, though, which actually would be kind of interesting to hear how it is in Korea, like for the US, within a health system, you can use these technologies without regulatory oversight as a means of quality improvement. So I think there's this tremendous opportunity for innovation within a health system for technologies developed within the health system. I don't know if it's similar here or...
I think in Korea, the regularization is quite, it's also strict, so it's hard to access the data in the hospital. Yeah, actually, I have not studied for the LLM models for that, so maybe, yeah, it's good to know that.
Yeah, and to answer your question, to Eric's point as well, USFDA is starting to open up in terms of autonomous AI within healthcare as well. recently, I guess recently about 2-3 years ago, they did approve an autonomous system for detecting diabetic retinopathy, for example, right? And it's like available in the clinics, where it's not necessarily saying that you go get a surgery done, but it says that, okay, you have something wrong, go see a specialist, right? And that's all totally autonomous. So.
I just want to add to what you asked. Besides the regulatory aspects, having an AI system can make healthcare more accessible in countries that do not have enough radiologists, do not have enough doctors to read, or like we have everything, but something like that, I guess people would be more favorable to the use of AI as a screening tool or risk assessment tool when you do not have an actual radiologist to look at it. Yeah. So that's another.
Cool. But data is very expensive, so it's really not to share to the others.
It's more like deployment at that point rather than developing.
I guess I'll ask one more question each from two sets of audience. So for the healthcare folks, like one another reason I feel that there's a discrepancy in research and development in healthcare is essentially the choice of metrics that people use who are developing the models. Like they're hyper-focused on two things. One is increasing the model size these days because it's in fashion. And the second is using the metrics like the AUROCs and stuff like that, which clinicians, I mean, I guess you can correct me if I'm wrong, do not necessarily care, right? So how do you break that barrier? Like, how do you sort of educate folks who are working in this space to not focus on stuff that will not be clinically relevant?
I think that's a great question because in general AI, if you have a detection problem or a classification problem, accuracy is the metric you use, right? In healthcare, you cannot use accuracy. People care more about negative predictive value, positive predictive value, which takes into account the actual prevalence of the disease. Like if I had 100 people of which only one had the disease, and my model was classifying everybody as not having disease, then my model has great accuracy. But it's not identifying that one person who has it. So using the right metrics in the right domain is the key, at least for all of us who work in healthcare. I would never use accuracy as a metric to assess how my model is performing. I would use sensitivity, specificity, negative predictive value, positive predictive value of the disease. So having this domain knowledge of what is the right way to assess the performance of your model for the task that you're trying to solve in relation to the domain in which you're working matters. So that would be my answer.
Do you want to comment, or I guess you agree with that?
I mean, I completely agree. That I think there's in another talk of mine, I have a slide showing that like really clinicians and computer scientists speak almost two completely disjoint languages. And I think part of the fun, though, of sort of the medical AI journey is really finding ways of bridging that.
Dr. Kim?
I mean, Lavanya is commented many things, so yeah.
Gotcha.
I think
cool.
It's the same.
I guess last question to wrap it up with Lerrel and Irmak. So, is obsession with scaling, like building bigger models, more data, and more compute masking our actual understanding of what we want to build? Specifically, are we really building, again, elaborate physical pattern matchers, or are we actually really building intelligent robots?
Yeah, I think, again, this is a fundamental question, right, for like, even people working in language and vision where things seem to work, there's a question of, are these systems intelligent, right? I think pattern matching at some high level is intelligence. And so the data scaling, it is definitely definitely a type of intelligence, maybe not a human type of intelligence, but it's useful, right? Like LLMs are useful, these vision models are clearly useful. So the hope is that by scaling up data in different ways, we can make robot systems also useful. But are they the same type of intelligence as humans? Probably not. They're very, very different. Yeah.
Yeah, I also agree that I think we are building some intelligence, and yes, imitating the data, like imitating the distribution of the data that we have or we can have is intelligent and has a lot of great applications. But I think there are data that we will never be able to get that we need to actually scale this up. So I think just imitational learning, end-to-end imitational learning is not going to solve AGI, is what I think. And so I think I think thinking about how we can generate this data in different ways, how we can enable robots to interact with the environment is valuable.
Cool. Awesome. I guess we are out of time now. So thank you all once again for your talks and for an interesting discussion. So maybe let's give a big round of applause for all the panelists.